Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. It was one of those autumn nights when the wind seemed to whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. The leaves, browned and withered, swirled around the old iron lampposts that lined the quiet street. In the distance, the town clock struck midnight with a hollow chime, marking the start of the night when everything would change. Liam leaned back against the hood of his car, the cold metal biting through his jacket. He was surrounded by his friends, Sarah, Marcus, Emma, and Dylan, who were all huddled close, trying to stay warm in the chilly air. The group was restless, their breath visible in the frosty night. They had all gathered for their usual weekend hangout, but the conversation had taken a darker turn. "You guys heard about Blackwood House, right?" Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying the name too loudly might summon something unwanted. The others exchanged wary glances, except for Marcus, who snorted in disbelief. Yeah, haunted house, creepy old man who did rituals, blah blah blah. It's just a bunch of stories to scare kids," Marcus said, rolling his eyes. Sarah shook her head. "It's more than just stories, Marcus. People have disappeared there. My cousin swears he saw lights in the windows, even though the place has been abandoned for years." "Please," Emma scoffed, though there was an edge of nervousness in her voice. "It's just some old house. There's probably squatters or animals in there, not ghosts." But the air around them seemed to grow colder, as if the mention of the house's name carried some kind of curse. Liam, who had been mostly silent, cleared his throat. "All right, let's settle this once and for all. I say we go there tonight." Dylan's eyes widened. "Wait, you're actually serious? I was just kidding." "Scared?" Liam teased, a grin spreading across his face. "I mean, it's just an old house, right? What's there to be afraid of?" Emma bit her lip, her eyes darting nervously between her friends. "I don't know, Liam. The stories, they aren't just legends. People say once you step inside, the house knows you're there. It feeds on fear." Sarah nodded in agreement, but Marcus scoffed again. "You all sound like you're 12. Fine, let's make it interesting. If we can stay in Blackwood House until dawn, I'll buy everyone breakfast for a month." Liam smirked. "And if we chicken out, then you're buying," Marcus shot back, crossing his arms confidently. "What's it gonna be?" There was a pause as everyone considered the offer, the thrill of the dare mixed with the tension in the air. Finally, Emma sighed. "Fine, but if something happens, I'm blaming all of you." With the challenge accepted, they piled into Liam's car, the engine roaring to life. As they drove through the darkened streets, the town's familiar lights faded behind them. The road became narrower and bumpier as they approached the outskirts, the trees closing in like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky. After a tense half-hour drive, the headlights finally illuminated the looming silhouette of Blackwood House. The mansion stood like a forgotten relic at the edge of the forest, its roof sagging under decades of decay. Its windows were shattered, the glass glinting like jagged teeth in the moonlight. Vines crawled up the walls, almost as if the forest itself was trying to swallow the house whole. "Jesus, it's worse than I imagined," Dylan muttered, leaning forward in his seat for a better look. "Let's get this over with," Liam said, parking the car on the overgrown gravel driveway. He killed the engine, and for a moment there was only silence, heavy, oppressive, and suffocating. As they climbed out of the car, the cold seemed to wrap around them like a damp shroud. The house loomed ahead, its once grand front door now hanging slightly ajar, as if inviting them to step inside. "This place is seriously giving me the creeps," Sarah whispered, clutching Emma's arm. But there was no turning back now. Pride, curiosity, and the weight of the dare pushed them forward. Marcus led the way, pulling a heavy flashlight from his backpack. "Let's go. First one to scream owes the rest of us a drink." he joked, though his voice shook slightly. The group walked up the cracked stone steps, the wind howling around them like a distant wail. The floorboards creaked ominously under their feet as they crossed the threshold into the house. The moment they stepped inside, the door behind them creaked shut with a loud bang, making them all jump. "Was that the wind?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper, but no one answered. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of damp rot and something else they couldn't quite place. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for them to arrive. As they ventured deeper into the darkness, their flashlights flickered. The shadows seemed to move just out of sight, and somewhere in the depths of the house, a faint tapping sound echoed. It was as if the house was waking up. The old house loomed before them like a sleeping beast, hidden away in the dense, tangled woods that surrounded it. The crumbling structure looked as though it was sagging under the weight of its own dark history. The wind whispered through the towering trees, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. It was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional rustle of the branches above. Liam cut the engine, plunging them into a sudden, suffocating quiet. The headlights dimmed, leaving only the moon's feeble light to cast long, eerie shadows across the front of Blackwood House. As the group stepped out of the car, the gravel crunched underfoot, sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Dylan adjusted his jacket, trying to suppress a shiver. "This place doesn't feel right," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as though something might be watching from the darkness beyond the trees. "Don't go chicken on us now," Marcus teased, though his voice was forced. "It's just an old rundown house. We'll be in and out. By sunrise, we'll be laughing about this over waffles." Sarah shot him a skeptical look, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. "If we make it to sunrise," she said, only half joking. Her eyes kept darting to the shadows, convinced they were moving just beyond her line of sight. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steel her nerves. "Let's just go inside," she said, stepping forward with more confidence than she felt. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant as they approached the house's sagging porch. The wooden planks groaned under their weight, and the railing, covered in creeping ivy, seemed to twitch in the cold breeze. The front door, which hung ajar, looked like a gaping mouth ready to swallow them whole. Liam pushed it open the rest of the way with a loud creak that echoed through the night. The darkness inside seemed impenetrable, as if it were a living thing waiting to consume them. "All right, everyone stay close," Liam said, turning on his flashlight. Its beam cut through the dusty air, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway stretching into the shadows. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. The group hesitated at the threshold, instinctively knowing that crossing it would be a point of no return. But the lure of the dare, and the desire to prove they weren't afraid, pushed them forward. As soon as they all stepped inside, the door behind them slammed shut with a thunderous bang, causing everyone to jump. The sound reverberated through the house like the tolling of some unseen bell. Emma turned back to the door, her heart pounding, but it was sealed tight. "Wind, right?" Marcus said, his voice a little too high-pitched. He forced a laugh, but no one joined him. "Yeah, wind," Sarah echoed, though her voice was hollow. She pressed closer to Emma, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that they had just walked into a trap. The hallway before them was long and narrow, lined with dark wood paneling that was cracked and peeling. Dust motes floated through the air, illuminated by their flashlights. Old portraits hung crookedly on the walls, their subjects' faces faded and their eyes gouged out, leaving dark, empty sockets. It felt like those empty eyes were watching their every move. "Let's check out the main hall first," Liam suggested, trying to keep the group focused. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. He didn't want to admit it, but even he was feeling the oppressive weight of the house's atmosphere. As they moved deeper into the mansion, the floorboards groaned beneath their weight, sending echoes into the dark recesses of the house. The temperature seemed to drop with every step they took. It was unnaturally cold, and each breath came out in frosty puffs. They emerged from the hallway into what must have once been a grand foyer. A massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals coated in a thick layer of dust. The once opulent staircase that dominated the room had partially collapsed, leaving jagged wooden beams pointing upwards like broken ribs. Moonlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting pale beams of light that seemed to flicker, as though struggling against the darkness. "This place is a death trap," Dylan muttered, looking at the crumbling staircase. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." "You're welcome to head back to the car if you're scared," Marcus shot back with a smirk, but even he didn't sound convinced. His flashlight beam trembled slightly as he scanned the room. Emma's attention was drawn to a grand, ornate door on the far side of the foyer. Its surface was carved with strange symbols that seemed to twist and shift under the flickering light. "Hey, do you guys see that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could respond, a soft thump echoed through the foyer, followed by a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just the house settling," Marcus said, though his face had gone pale. "No way," Dylan muttered, shaking his head. "That sounded like footsteps." They stood frozen for a moment, listening. The house was silent again, as if it were holding its breath. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash came from somewhere deep within the mansion, followed by the sound of something or someone whispering. The whispers were unintelligible, but they were coming from all around them, echoing off the walls. Emma's hands shook as she gripped her flashlight tighter, the beam dancing across the crumbling wallpaper. Liam turned to the others, his face grim. "We need to stick together," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "No splitting up. We'll find a room we can barricade ourselves in and wait this out until morning." But the house seemed to have other plans. As they turned to head back the way they came, they found the hallway they had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of decaying wood. The layout of the house had shifted, as if it were alive and determined to trap them. "What the hell?" Marcus shouted, pounding on the wall. "The door was right here." "Calm down," Liam hissed, though his voice was filled with panic. "We just took a wrong turn. We'll find another way out." But deep down, they all knew the truth. The house was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and now they were part of it. A soft, ghostly whisper drifted through the air again, closer this time. It seemed to come from every direction at once, calling their names. Welcome home. The mansion's shifting layout had thrown them into a state of panic. Where the hallway they had entered through once stood, there was now only a blank wall, covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to pulse like rotting flesh. Liam's pulse was racing, his breath coming out in rapid bursts. The oppressive air of the house was growing thicker, like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Okay, Liam muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Let's keep moving. There has to be another way out." Sarah clung to Emma's arm, her eyes darting around the dimly lit foyer. The air was colder than before, almost freezing, and she could see her breath turning to mist. "Liam, I don't think we're alone in here," she whispered. "Of course we're not," Marcus snapped, his usual bravado cracking. "This place is a goddamn maze. It's like it's playing with us." Dylan shone his flashlight around the room, the beam jittery from his shaking hands. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, as if the darkness itself was alive. "I swear, I heard someone whisper my name," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was like, right next to my ear." "Let's just keep moving," Liam urged. "Standing here freaking out isn't going to help us." The group pressed forward, deeper into the house. The floor creaked underfoot with every step, the sound echoing through the hollow corridors. They turned corner after corner, but the hallways seemed endless, leading them deeper into the mansion's dark, decaying heart. After what felt like hours, they reached another large door. Unlike the others they had passed, this one was different, taller, older, and more ornate. The wood was dark, almost black, with intricate carvings that twisted and curled like tendrils. Strange symbols had been etched into the surface, symbols that none of them could recognize. "What the hell is this?" Marcus asked, reaching out to touch the door. "Wait," Emma hissed, grabbing his wrist. "Don't touch it." Marcus gave her a skeptical look, but there was something in her eyes, pure, unfiltered fear. "What's your problem?" he muttered, but he didn't pull away from her grip. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the strange symbols. I've seen something like this before," she said, her voice shaking. "In one of those documentaries about ancient cults. These symbols, they're used for summoning or sealing something in." A chill ran down Liam's spine, and he felt an almost instinctual urge to turn back. But they had no other options. Every other door they had tried was locked or led them in circles. "We have to check it out," he said, forcing himself to stay calm. "It's either this or we keep wandering around until we die of hypothermia." Dylan gave a reluctant nod, and Marcus, still trying to prove he wasn't afraid, reached out and twisted the tarnished brass handle. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. "All right, stick together," Liam whispered, stepping through the doorway with his flashlight held high. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, carrying a damp, putrid scent that made Emma gag. As they moved deeper into the room, their flashlights revealed rows of dusty furniture shrouded in moth-eaten cloths. It looked like a storage room, but something about it felt wrong. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners, refusing to be dispelled by the light. "Look," Sarah said suddenly, her voice trembling. She pointed to the far end of the room where a heavy wooden table stood. On it lay a series of strange objects, melted candles, dried herbs, and a thick, leather-bound book covered in dust. Marcus approached the table, curiosity overtaking his fear. He brushed off the dust and opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten text. "This looks like some kind of journal," he said, flipping through it. The handwriting was jagged and frantic. The ink smeared in places, as though the writer's hands had been shaking. "Whose journal is it?" Emma asked, stepping closer to read over his shoulder. It belonged to Edgar Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice trailing off as he scanned the pages. "The guy who used to live here. He talks about things he summoned, spirits, demons." "Let me see that," Dylan said, snatching the journal. As he flipped through the pages, his flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. This guy was seriously messed up," he muttered. "He talks about sacrifices, rituals, and something called the hunger." Suddenly, a soft, rhythmic thump echoed through the room. It was faint at first, almost like a heartbeat. Everyone froze, their flashlights trembling as they tried to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the far side of the room. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Marcus shone his flashlight toward the corner, and they all saw it. A small door, half hidden behind a stack of old furniture. The door was different from the others they had seen. Its surface was covered in deep gouges, as if something had desperately tried to claw its way out. "Should we open it?" Dylan asked, his voice barely audible. "Hell no," Emma snapped. "Whatever's in there, it was sealed for a reason." But Marcus was already moving toward the door, driven by a mix of curiosity and adrenaline. "Come on. It's probably just a raccoon or something," he said, trying to sound brave. He grasped the rusted handle and pulled. The door wouldn't budge. "See, it's locked." "Let's leave it alone," Sarah said, relief flooding her voice. But as soon as she spoke, the rhythmic thumping grew louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was behind that door had heard them and was desperate to get out. "Marcus, stop," Liam warned, stepping forward. But Marcus was determined. He threw his shoulder against the door, and with a loud crack, it finally gave way. The door burst open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway that led downward. A blast of freezing air rushed out, carrying with it a foul, coppery stench that made them all gag. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something far worse, something that should not exist in this world. Close it. Close it now, Emma screamed, her eyes wide with terror. But it was too late. The darkness in the passage seemed to ripple, and something began to crawl up from the depths, its shape indistinct but undeniably wrong. The air around them grew heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Liam and Marcus slammed the door shut, but the thumping on the other side continued, even more frenzied than before. The house seemed to tremble, and the whispers returned, louder, clearer, chanting in a language none of them could understand. "Run!" Liam yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm. They fled the room, their footsteps echoing through the darkened halls as the sound of that horrific growl followed them. Whatever they had just unleashed, it was no longer confined to the locked room. And it was coming for them. The group's panicked footsteps echoed through the narrow, twisting hallways as they fled from the locked room. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, making it hard to breathe. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the house, as if it were deliberately trying to disorient them. It was no longer a question of finding a way out. Their only thought now was to put as much distance as possible between them and whatever they had unleashed. "Where the hell are we?" Dylan panted, his voice ragged. "None of these halls look familiar." "I don't know!" Liam shouted, frustration seeping into his voice. "The house, it keeps changing. Just keep moving." As they turned a corner, they stumbled into what seemed to be an old sitting room. The once luxurious furnishings were now covered in thick layers of dust, the upholstery faded and torn. Heavy, moth-eaten curtains hung limply over cracked windows, blocking out what little moonlight could filter through. Sarah leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. We can't keep running like this," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to find somewhere to hide, just for a moment." Marcus nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing air. "Fine, but let's make it quick. Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stop until it finds us." Emma's eyes darted around the room, her flashlight sweeping over the dusty remnants of another era. "Look, there's a door over there," she pointed. "Maybe it leads to a room where we can catch our breath." Without waiting for a consensus, Emma pushed open the door. The hinges let out a mournful creak, revealing a smaller, dimly lit chamber. The room was dominated by an enormous, ornate mirror that was nearly as tall as the ceiling. It was set in a heavy, dark wood frame that was intricately carved with swirling, almost hypnotic patterns. The glass itself was grimy, its surface fogged over with age. The moment they stepped inside, the air turned frigid, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The cold was biting, almost unnatural, making their skin prickle with goosebumps. "Let's just stay here for a minute," Liam said, trying to steady his breathing. "We need to figure out what the hell we're going to do." Dylan, still shaking from the adrenaline, sat down on a dusty armchair, his flashlight flickering weakly. "This place it's alive," he whispered, staring at the walls as if expecting them to move. "I swear I heard it whispering to me back there." "Don't say that," Sarah hissed, hugging herself tightly. "The house is just old. It's creaking, that's all." But they all knew it wasn't just the creaking of old wood. The house was alive, watching them, listening to their every move. Meanwhile, Emma couldn't take her eyes off the mirror. There was something strange about it, something that drew her in despite the knot of fear in her stomach. The glass seemed to shimmer, almost like it was breathing. Curious, she wiped her hand across the dusty surface, clearing a small patch. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. It was subtle at first. Her reflection's eyes were a shade darker than her own, and its expression seemed slightly off, more rigid, almost menacing. "Guys, there's something weird about this mirror," Emma called out, her voice laced with unease. "What now?" Marcus grumbled, but he got up and walked over to stand next to her. As Marcus joined Emma, he peered into the mirror, but he saw nothing unusual, just their reflections, standing side by side in the dusty room. "Looks like a normal mirror to me," he said with a shrug. But even as he spoke, he noticed Emma's reflection wasn't moving. While the real Emma turned to glance at Marcus, her reflection remained facing forward, its eyes locked on his. What the? Marcus blinked, convinced he was imagining things. But when he looked back, Emma's reflection slowly began to grin, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Emma, do you see that? He whispered, panic rising in his throat. See what? Emma asked, turning back to the mirror. To her, everything appeared normal. But Marcus staggered back, his face pale. He watched in horror as Emma's reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass, as though trying to break through. Guys, we need to get out of this room! Marcus shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her away from the mirror. The others, hearing the panic in his voice, immediately sprang to their feet. But it was too late. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and a cold skeletal hand shot out, grabbing Marcus's wrist with a grip like iron. He screamed as he felt something icy cold wrap around his arm, pulling him toward the mirror with unnatural strength. Help me! It's got me! Marcus yelled, desperately trying to pull free. The others rushed forward, grabbing onto him, trying to drag him back. But whatever was in the mirror was far stronger than it looked. Liam and Dylan managed to pull Marcus free just as the mirror's hand released him. He fell back onto the floor, gasping, his face pale and covered in sweat. A dark bruise in the shape of skeletal fingers was already forming on his wrist. What the hell was that? Sarah cried, backing away from the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. The mirror's surface was calm again, but now there were faint, ghostly faces pressing against the glass, their eyes hollow and mouths open in silent screams. The faces seemed to shift and writhe, as though they were trapped inside, desperate to escape. It's some kind of trap, Emma stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Whatever Edgar Blackwood did, it's in that mirror. We have to get out of this room, Liam shouted. Now. Just as they turned to leave, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash. The chandelier above them flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like grasping hands. We're trapped! Dylan yelled, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had sealed them in. Then, a low, mocking laugh filled the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was cold, inhuman, filled with malice. The faces in the mirror began to move faster, their eyes following the group, their mouths twisting into grotesque grins. Liam's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The laughter grew louder, more intense, filling their ears until it was almost deafening. Sarah let out a scream, and suddenly the mirror shattered with an explosive crash, sending shards of glass flying in every direction. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. The room was pitch black, and the air seemed to hum with malevolent energy. Everyone okay? Liam gasped, reaching out blindly for the others. Yeah, I think so, Emma replied, her voice shaky. But where's Marcus? A faint glow came from where the mirror once stood. In its place there was now a gaping, dark hole, a doorway that led into an even deeper darkness. And Marcus was nowhere to be seen. Marcus? Sarah called out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the sound of a soft, distant whisper coming from beyond the dark portal. The house had taken its first victim. The air in the shattered mirror room was thick with panic. Shards of glass crunched underfoot as they frantically searched for Marcus. The dark portal where the mirror once stood loomed ominously, a gaping maw into an even deeper darkness. Sarah's voice was shaky as she called out again. Marcus? Marcus, can you hear me? There was no reply, only the faint echo of her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The cold seeped into their bones, making it hard to think straight. It felt as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a move. Where did he go? Dylan muttered, his eyes wide with fear. He was right here. Maybe he fell through that hole, Emma suggested, her voice quivering as she pointed to the dark opening where the mirror had been. But if he did, why isn't he answering? Liam's jaw tightened. We can't just stand here. We have to go after him. You're insane, Sarah snapped. her eyes glistening with tears. "We don't even know where that leads. This place it's not right. If we go in there, we might never come out." Liam turned to face her, his expression grim. "I'm not leaving Marcus behind. If it were you, he'd go after you too." The group exchanged terrified glances, but ultimately, they knew Liam was right. With a collective breath, they stepped toward the dark portal, the faint sound of distant whispers growing louder with every step. One by one, they crawled through the opening. The air beyond was even colder, like stepping into a tomb. The sound of their breathing was loud in the stillness as they emerged into a narrow, damp staircase that spiraled downward into the bowels of the house. The scent of mildew and rot was overpowering, making their eyes water. "Why does every horror movie have to include a creepy basement?" Dylan muttered under his breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Shut up," Emma whispered, her flashlight shaking in her hands. "We need to stay focused." The stairs seemed endless, spiraling down into a darkness so deep their flashlights could barely penetrate it. The cold stone walls were slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed around them, magnifying their anxiety. It was as if they were descending into the very heart of the house. Finally, they reached the bottom. The staircase opened up into a vast underground chamber, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above. Their flashlight beams revealed dusty shelves lined with ancient, crumbling books, strange jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and the remnants of what looked like occult paraphernalia scattered across the floor. "This must have been Blackwood's ritual room," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is where he did, whatever it was he did." Sarah's flashlight swept across the chamber and she froze. "Oh God, look!" At the far end of the room was a large, crudely drawn circle etched into the stone floor, filled with strange, archaic symbols. In the center of the circle was a low altar, covered in what appeared to be dried blood. Chains hung from the walls, their rusty links rattling softly in the draft. "What kind of sick stuff was this guy into?" Dylan asked, his voice tinged with disgust. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the altar. "These symbols, they're the same as the ones on the door upstairs. He was trying to trap something, or summon it." A sudden noise, a faint, echoing cry, broke the silence. It was Marcus's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help, please." Sarah's eyes widened. "Did you hear that? It's Marcus! He's alive!" Without waiting for the others, she dashed toward the sound, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Sarah, wait!" Liam yelled, but she was already sprinting deeper into the darkness. The rest of the group chased after her, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. They followed the sound of Marcus's cries until they came to a narrow doorway hidden behind a dusty bookshelf. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it was a narrow, dark corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. "Marcus, can you hear us?" Liam shouted, but only silence answered. The corridor was so narrow that they had to walk single file, their flashlights barely illuminating the way forward. The deeper they went, the colder it became, their breath misting in the frigid air. It felt like the house was leading them somewhere, guiding them like lambs to the slaughter. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into another room. This one was smaller, the walls lined with what looked like torture instruments, rusted blades, cruel-looking hooks, and chains stained dark with something that might have been blood. But what caught their attention was the figure slumped in the far corner. "Marcus!" Sarah cried, rushing forward. Marcus was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at something only he could see. His wrists were bound with thick chains, the metal cutting into his skin. As they got closer, they realized his lips were moving, but no sound came out. Liam knelt beside him, trying to shake him out of his stupor. "Marcus, hey, it's us, we're here!" But Marcus didn't react. His eyes were glassy, as if he were in a trance. Then, without warning, his mouth opened wide in a silent scream, and his body convulsed violently. "What's happening to him?" Emma cried, backing away in terror. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the lights from their flashlights flickered. A cold, malevolent presence filled the room. pressing against their minds like icy fingers. The air was thick with the smell of burning hair and sulfur. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around them, reverberating through the walls. The shadows on the walls twisted and coiled, taking on shapes that were almost human, but horribly distorted. Sarah screamed as one of the shadows reached out, its long, clawed fingers grazing her cheek. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in, trapping them with whatever horror they had awakened. Dylan tried to pull Marcus to his feet, but Marcus was like dead weight. "We have to get out of here!" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. But the doorway they had entered through was now gone, replaced by solid stone. They were trapped, surrounded on all sides by those writhing shadows, the growling growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, Marcus's eyes snapped into focus. His voice, deep and distorted, was not his own. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his lips twisting into a cruel grin. "The house has already claimed you." Liam's blood ran cold. "Marcus, what's wrong with you?" But the thing that was wearing Marcus's face only laughed, a sound that was both human and inhuman at the same time. Then, with a strength that shouldn't have been possible, he shoved Dylan to the ground, his hands now more like claws than human fingers. "Run!" Emma screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand. The others didn't need to be told twice. They bolted deeper into the darkness, leaving Marcus behind. As they fled, the house seemed to shift and contort around them, hallways stretching and twisting like the insides of some enormous, hungry beast. The growling followed them, a chorus of voices blending into a monstrous howl. Behind them, Marcus's laughter echoed, growing louder and more manic, as if the house itself was laughing along with him. Whatever they had unleashed was now free, and it was hungry. The walls seemed to close in on them as they ran. The once spacious corridors twisted like the coils of a serpent, turning the house into a labyrinth of darkness and decay. The shrill sound of Marcus's distorted laughter echoed behind them, growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and whatever horror he had become. But the terror didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified, as if the house itself was whispering threats into their ears. "Keep moving," Liam urged, his voice cracking with fear. "We can't stop now. I can't breathe," Sarah panted, her hand clutching her side. "My chest, it's too tight." Emma grabbed Sarah's arm, practically dragging her forward. "We have to find somewhere to hide. We need time to think." Dylan's flashlight flickered, its weak beam sputtering before plunging them into near darkness. The only light now came from Liam's flashlight, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to dance on the walls like specters. Finally, they stumbled into a room at the end of a winding hallway. Liam slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them, twisting the rusted lock with trembling hands. The door shuddered under his grip, but mercifully it held. They were in what looked like an old study. The room was cramped, lined with towering bookshelves filled with rotting tomes and papers. A massive desk covered in dust and cobwebs dominated the center of the room. The air smelled stale, tinged with the metallic scent of old ink and mold. "What the hell is happening?" Dylan hissed, pacing back and forth. "First Marcus, now the house. This place is alive, man. It's trying to kill us." "Keep your voice down," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "I don't know if Marcus can hear us." Liam's eyes were drawn to the desk. Something glinted under the pale beam of his flashlight, an old, leather-bound book, thicker than any of the others they had seen. Its cover was cracked and brittle, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. He brushed off the dust, revealing faded gold letters embossed on the cover, Journal of Edgar Blackwood. "This has to have something about what's happening here," Liam muttered, flipping it open. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with jagged handwriting that was barely legible. It was like reading the frantic scribbles of a madman. "Why are you wasting time on that?" Sarah demanded, her voice edged with panic. "We need to find a way out, not read some dead guy's diary." "Just give me a second," Liam insisted, scanning the pages frantically. "If Blackwood was behind all this, Maybe there's something in here that can help us. Emma and Dylan crowded around him, peering over his shoulder. The entries started off relatively normal details of Blackwood's daily life in the mansion, descriptions of parties and visitors. But as they read on, the tone changed, becoming darker, more desperate. September 3rd, 1923. The voices are getting louder. They whisper secrets, promises of power, but only if I am willing to open the door. I must perform the ritual correctly this time. I am so close. September 14th, 1923. The house demands sacrifices. It must be fed to stay silent. The shadows crawl from the walls at night. I hear them whispering in the dark, calling my name. They are hungry, always hungry. October 1st, 1923. I have made a terrible mistake. The entity, it is no mere spirit. It is something older, something that was never meant to be summoned. I thought I could control it, but now it controls me. The house is its prison, and I am its keeper. It will not let me leave. The final entry was dated mere days before Blackwood disappeared without a trace. October 31st, 1923. It is coming for me. The walls are closing in. The shadows whisper my doom. It demands another soul, another to take my place. The house will not let me go. I fear it has already chosen who will stay. I must seal the doors. The entry ended abruptly. The ink smeared as if written in a frantic hurry. The rest of the page was stained dark with something that looked disturbingly like blood. "What does this mean?" Dylan asked, his voice shaky. Are we part of this ritual?" Emma's face was pale as she pointed to a passage near the end of the journal. "Look here," she said, her finger trembling over a line of text. It says, "The entity is bound to the house. It feeds on fear, on pain. Only by offering a soul can it be appeased. The ritual circle must remain intact to contain it." Liam's eyes widened. "That circle we saw in the basement, it's not just a trap, it's a seal. If it's broken, the entity is free to hunt anyone inside the house." "But it already has, Marcus," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "How do we stop it?" Liam flipped through the journal desperately. "There's something here, something about reversing the ritual, but it's incomplete." He slammed the book shut in frustration. "The last page is missing." "What the hell are we supposed to do with that?" Dylan snapped. "We can't seal something if we don't know the whole ritual." A loud crash echoed from somewhere in the house, followed by the sound of that guttural growl they had heard earlier. The door behind them trembled, as if something heavy was throwing itself against it, trying to break in. "We have to move," Emma urged. "It's found us." But just as they were about to rush out of the room, Liam noticed something sticking out from under the desk, a small, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. He grabbed it, unfolding it with shaking hands. The handwriting was the same as Blackwood's, but it was scrawled in a frenzy, barely legible. To break the curse, one must offer their fear willingly. One must stand in the circle and face the shadows without turning away. Only then can the entity be banished back to its prison. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with terror. "It means one of us has to face it," Liam said, his voice hollow. "We have to lure it back to the circle in the basement, and someone has to stand in it, offering themselves as bait." The pounding on the door intensified, the wood splintering under the relentless assault. The whispers outside the door turned into screams, as if 100 voices were shrieking in unison. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "There's no way we're getting out of here alive, is there?" Liam set his jaw. "Maybe not all of us, but if we can trap that thing, at least some of us might." The door burst open, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It wore Marcus's face, but its eyes were black pits, and its mouth twisted into a cruel, unnatural grin. "You can't hide," it hissed, its voice a grotesque blend of Marcus's and something much darker. "The house demands another soul." They had no time left. It was time to make a choice. The door to the study exploded inward, sending splinters flying in every direction. The figure that had once been Marcus stood in the doorway, its eyes nothing more than dark, endless voids. Its smile was a grotesque mockery of Marcus's once friendly grin. stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. For a moment, the group froze in terror. The thing wearing Marcus's face stared at them, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were amused by their fear. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, it lunged forward. "Run!" Liam screamed, shoving Sarah toward the door on the opposite side of the room. Dylan grabbed the journal and stuffed it into his backpack, while Emma pulled Sarah along, her fingers digging into Sarah's arm hard enough to leave marks. The group darted through the narrow doorway, fleeing into the darkness of another twisting hallway. Behind them, the creature that had been Marcus let out a guttural roar, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. It was no longer just pursuing them, it was hunting them, driven by hunger and malice. They sprinted through the labyrinth of corridors, the air growing colder with every step. Their flashlights flickered, casting erratic beams that made the shadows around them seem to writhe and twist like living things. As they turned a corner, Sarah stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully. She let out a cry, but Liam hauled her up, not slowing his pace. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice hoarse with desperation. But the house was relentless. The walls around them seemed to shift and warp, closing in like the jaws of a great beast. Doors appeared and vanished, corridors twisted and turned back on themselves, leading them deeper into the mansion's grasp. The air was filled with the sound of distant whispers, voices that seemed to come from the very walls, calling each of them by name. Emma, Liam, Sarah. The voices were soft, seductive, like a lover's whisper. "Why are you running? You belong here. Stay, forever." "Shut up!" Dylan screamed, clutching his head. The whispers were getting louder, drilling into their minds, trying to worm their way into their thoughts. He could hear his mother's voice, his father's, all whispering the same thing. "Stay. Give in. It will be over soon." Emma's flashlight flickered out completely, plunging her into darkness. She let out a choked sob, stumbling forward blindly. Liam grabbed her hand, pulling her along, but the whispers seemed to be getting louder, more insistent. They were no longer just voices, they were memories, fears, secrets being dragged to the surface. Sarah suddenly stopped, her eyes wide and unfocused. I hear my sister," her voice distant, as if she were in a trance. "She's crying. She needs me." "No, it's a trick," Liam shouted, shaking her violently. "Sarah, snap out of it. It's not real." But the voices were getting to all of them. Dylan had stopped running, his eyes glazed over as he listened to something only he could hear. Emma was clutching her head, tears streaming down her face as she mumbled incoherently, lost in some nightmare only she could see. Liam felt his own resolve cracking as he heard his father's voice, a low, familiar tone filled with disappointment. "You never had the courage, Liam. You're just a coward, running away like always." The pressure in his head was unbearable, like a vice tightening around his skull. But he gritted his teeth and forced himself to move. "We have to get to the basement," he muttered through clenched teeth. "The circle. It's our only chance." With a monumental effort, he yanked Dylan out of his stupor. "Dylan, snap out of it. You have the journal, remember? We have to complete the ritual." Dylan blinked, the fog in his eyes clearing for a moment. "All right, the ritual." He took a shaky breath and nodded. "Let's go." Liam, Emma, Sarah, and Dylan pushed forward, leaning on each other for support. The house fought them every step of the way. Doors that once led to the basement now opened into pitch-black voids, the floors beneath them creaking ominously, as if ready to collapse. But they kept moving, driven by the sliver of hope that if they could complete the ritual, they might still have a chance. Finally, they burst through a door and found themselves at the top of the staircase, leading down to the basement. The air here was even colder, almost freezing. The shadows seemed to dance and flicker, reaching out like dark tendrils trying to drag them back into the depths of the house. "We're almost there," Liam gasped, half carrying Sarah down the stairs. "Just a little farther." As they reached the bottom, the basement seemed even more ominous than before. The ritual circle was still there, drawn in dark, dried blood. The symbols etched into the floor seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the steady thumping that filled the air like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature. The journal said someone has to stand in the circle, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in their heads. Someone has to face it willingly. The words hung heavy in the air, each of them knowing what it meant. One of them had to offer themselves, to become the bait to draw the entity back into its prison. "I'll do it," Dylan said suddenly, stepping forward. His voice was shaking, but there was a resoluteness in his eyes. "I'm the one who found the journal. This might be my fault. If someone's gonna do it, it should be me." "No," Emma said, stepping in front of him. "You can't, Dylan. We need you to read the ritual. You have to be the one to finish it." Liam's face was pale, his eyes darting between his friends. The voices were louder now, screaming at him, filling his mind with images of death, of failure. But he pushed it all down. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'm the one who dragged all of you here. If this is how it ends, then I'll face it." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "You don't have to do this, Liam," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I do," Liam replied, stepping into the circle. The moment his foot touched the dried blood, the air in the basement seemed to shift, growing even colder. The shadows on the walls began to swirl, drawn toward the circle, as if pulled by an invisible force. "Dylan, start reading!" Liam shouted, his voice shaking as the shadows began to coalesce into a dark, writhing mass in front of him. The entity's form was vague, shifting and changing, its eyes glowing like hot coals in the darkness. Dylan fumbled with the journal, his hands trembling. Okay. He found the page and began reading the ancient incantation, his voice barely rising above the howling wind that filled the basement. The entity let out a scream, a sound that tore through their minds like knives. The circle around Liam began to glow, the blood on the floor sizzling and smoking as the ritual took effect. "Keep going!" Emma shouted, clutching Sarah as they watched in horror. The entity was trying to break free, its tendrils lashing out, but the circle held, trapping it within. As Dylan read the final words of the incantation, the entity let out a final soul-piercing shriek. The light in the circle flared, blinding them all. And then, with a deafening boom, everything went silent. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. The basement was eerily quiet. Liam collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. The ritual was complete, but the cost had been high. The house was silent once more, but they all knew that it was only a matter of time before it awakened again, hungry for new souls. The aftermath of the ritual left the group in stunned silence. The air in the basement was still thick and cold, but the oppressive sense of malevolence had lifted. The shadows no longer seemed to move of their own accord, and the unholy whispers had finally gone silent. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the four friends who had survived the encounter with the entity. Liam lay on the cold stone floor of the basement, his body trembling from the ordeal. His skin was pale and clammy, and sweat dripped down his face, mingling with the grime and dried blood from the ritual circle. Emma knelt beside him, trying to check for any injuries. "Liam, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Liam opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light. I think so," he rasped, trying to catch his breath. But as he tried to stand, his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed back onto the ground. "Take it easy," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside him. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide and fearful. "You did it, Liam. You stopped it." But Dylan, still clutching the ancient journal in his hands, wasn't so sure. He stared at the circle on the ground, where the dried blood was now smoldering, releasing thin tendrils of smoke that smelled of burning metal and rot. We only contained it," he muttered, flipping through the last few pages of the journal. "I don't think we really banished it. It's sealed again, but for how long?" Emma looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "We did the ritual everything Blackwood wrote about. We closed the circle and trapped it." Dylan shook his head, a haunted look in his eyes. "There were pages missing. We don't know if what we did is permanent." For all we know, it's only sealed for a short time, until it finds another way out. Sarah shuddered, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off a sudden chill. Let's just get out of this basement. I can't stand being here another second. Emma nodded, helping Liam to his feet. He leaned on her heavily, his strength nearly spent. They moved toward the staircase, desperate to escape the claustrophobic darkness of the basement. As they reached the top of the stairs, Dylan paused, his flashlight illuminating the door that led back into the house. The wood was covered in strange, dark markings that hadn't been there before. "What the hell?" he whispered, tracing the symbols with his fingers. They looked like the ones they'd seen on Marcus's arm before he'd been taken by the entity. "Let's just go," Emma urged, not wanting to spend another moment in the cursed house. She pushed past Dylan, opening the door with a creak. They emerged into the ground floor, the air there slightly warmer, but still heavy with the scent of decay. The house seemed quieter, almost subdued, as if it were lying in wait. The group made their way through the twisting hallways, their footsteps echoing ominously. Every creak and groan of the old mansion set their nerves on edge, but there was no sign of the entity, or whatever was left of Marcus. "I don't hear it anymore," Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. "Do you think it's really over?" But as they approached the front door, Liam suddenly doubled over, clutching his arm in pain. "Ah! What the?" he gasped, dropping to his knees. Emma and Dylan rushed to his side, trying to see what was wrong. "Liam, what is it?" Emma asked, her voice laced with panic. Liam's eyes were wide with terror as he rolled up his sleeve. On his forearm, dark lines were appearing, spreading like ink beneath his skin. The same concentric circles with jagged lines that they had seen on Marcus's arm were now forming on Liam's flesh. The mark pulsed with a sickly red glow, as if it were alive. "Oh God, no!" Sarah whispered, backing away. "It's the same mark, the one Marcus had." Dylan stared at the mark in horror, the implications dawning on him. The entity, it left its mark on you, Liam. The ritual didn't stop it. It just transferred its curse. It's using you as its new host. Liam looked up, his face pale with dread. "What do you mean, using me?" Emma's eyes were wide with panic. "Dylan, what the hell are you talking about?" "The journal," Dylan said, frantically flipping through the pages again. "Remember? Blackwood wrote that the entity needed a soul to feed on, to stay anchored to this world. When we did the ritual, we trapped it again, but it needs a new host to keep it sealed. That's why it marked you, Liam. It's using you to stay bound here." No, this can't be happening," Liam said, shaking his head. But even as he spoke, the mark on his arm burned hotter, sending waves of pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, trying to stifle a scream. "We have to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice rising to a near hysterical pitch. "Maybe if we leave, it won't be able to follow us. Maybe it's bound to the house." Emma shook her head. "No, that's not how it works. It's inside him now. It's claimed him. Leaving the house won't change that." Liam gasped for breath, trying to stay upright. "Then what can we do?" Dylan closed the journal with a snap. "We have to find the missing pages. Blackwood must have had a way to remove the mark, to truly sever the entity's connection. If we don't, Liam will end up like Marcus." A deep, mocking laughter echoed through the house, the same laughter that had once belonged to Marcus. The walls seemed to shudder in response, the house coming alive again with renewed energy. It had been waiting for them to make this realization, to understand the full horror of their situation. "We're not safe here," Emma urged. "We have to go now." Supporting Liam between them, the group made a mad dash for the front door. The walls seemed to ripple as they passed, and the floor groaned as though it might collapse beneath their feet. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, promising pain, suffering, and death. They burst through the front door into the freezing night air, the wind howling around them like a chorus of screams. But even outside, Liam's mark continued to burn, the sinister glow casting eerie shadows across his face. Sarah turned to look back at the house. The windows, once dark, now glowed with a sickly green light, as if hundreds of eyes were watching them leave. The whispers seemed to follow them, a promise that their ordeal was far from over. "We have to find those pages," Dylan said, his voice filled with grim determination. "If we don't, the mark will consume Liam, and the entity will be free to hunt again." As they stumbled away from the house, the wind carried one last, chilling whisper to their ears. "You cannot escape. I am part of you now." Liam's eyes filled with despair. He was marked, and unless they found the missing pages, the entity would consume him completely. Their nightmare was far from over. This was only the beginning. The cold night air stung their faces as they sprinted away from the mansion. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers followed them, carried on the wind like a dark promise. Liam's breaths came in shallow gasps, the pain from the mark on his arm intensifying with every step. It felt like hot iron branding his skin, and every pulse of agony sent tremors through his entire body. "Keep moving!" Emma shouted, glancing back at the house. The windows of Blackwood House glowed with a sickly green light, like eyes glaring into the night, watching their every move. It was as if the mansion itself was trying to pull them back. Sarah was practically dragging Liam along, his weight slowing her down, but she refused to let go. "Liam, hold on," she cried, her voice breaking with panic. "We're going to figure this out." Dylan, leading the way with the journal clutched in his hands, suddenly skidded to a halt. "We can't outrun this thing," he shouted, turning to face the others. "The entity's connected to Liam now. No matter how far we go, it'll find us." "So what are we supposed to do?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We can't just leave him to die." Liam gritted his teeth, fighting against the waves of pain coursing through him. "Dylan's right," he said through clenched teeth. "Running won't change anything. We need to stop it, or at least break its hold on me." Emma's eyes darted around frantically. "We need a place to hide, somewhere we can figure out our next move. The house is too close. It can still reach us here." "There's an old church just outside the town limits," Dylan suggested. "No one's used it in years. If we can get there, maybe we can use the journal to finish the ritual, or at least buy us some time." The church was nearly a mile away, a relic from a forgotten era, standing alone on a hill surrounded by dense woods. It was a long shot, but it was the only sanctuary they could think of. With no other options, they made a break for it. The group ran through the forest, branches whipping at their faces, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows around them seemed to move of their own accord. The entity was closing in, feeding off Liam's fear and pain, growing stronger with every passing second. As they neared the old church, Liam stumbled and fell to his knees, clutching his arm where the mark was now glowing a bright, ominous red. I can't! It's burning!" he cried out, his voice raw with agony. Emma and Sarah rushed to his side, trying to help him up. But as they touched him, the mark seemed to flare, and they both felt a searing cold shoot through their hands, as if they'd touched dry ice. "It's like it's spreading," Emma gasped, pulling her hand back in horror. "We're running out of time." The church loomed ahead, its stained glass windows shattered and its roof partially collapsed, but it still stood as a dark silhouette against the night sky. The air around it felt different, quieter, almost as if the building were holding its breath. It was as if the old church was resisting the malevolent presence that was stalking them. They burst through the decaying wooden doors, the sound echoing through the empty sanctuary. Dust swirled in the air, and the faint scent of incense still lingered, a ghost of prayers long forgotten. The pews were broken, and the altar was covered in cobwebs, but the space felt safe. For now. "Close the door!" Dylan shouted. Sarah and Emma rushed to push the heavy wooden doors shut, barricading them with a broken pew. "This won't hold it for long," Dylan muttered, scanning the room. "We have to move fast." Liam collapsed onto the cold stone floor, groaning as the mark continued to spread, the dark lines crawling up his arm toward his chest. It's trying to take over," he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I can feel it, in my mind, like it's whispering to me." Dylan opened the journal, his hands shaking. "Okay, we need to figure this out," he said, frantically flipping through the pages. "There's got to be something in here that we missed, something about removing the mark." Sarah knelt beside Liam, her face pale with fear. "Liam, stay with us, okay? We're gonna fix this. You just have to hang on." But Liam's eyes were glassy, unfocused. The whispers in his mind were growing louder, drowning out everything else. He could hear his friends speaking, but their voices were distant, like echoes in a vast cavern. All he could hear clearly was the entity, its voice a cold, cruel whisper. "You can't escape me, Liam. You are mine now. Your fear is delicious, so sweet. Why fight it? Just give in." Emma, desperate, grabbed the journal from Dylan's hands. "There has to be a way to reverse the curse," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We sealed the entity, but it's still anchored to Liam. If we can sever that link, we might be able to." A sudden crash shook the church as the front doors shuddered, the wood splintering under a massive blow. The barricade trembled, and the air filled with that low, guttural growl that they had come to dread. "It's here!" Sarah screamed, backing away from the door. "Find the ritual," Liam rasped, struggling to stay conscious. "You have to break the link." Dylan frantically searched the journal, flipping to the last page where the instructions had been hastily scrawled. "There's something here, but it's incomplete. It says we need an object tied to the original summoning." Emma's eyes darted around the church, searching for anything that might help. Then she spotted it, a tarnished silver crucifix hanging above the old altar, its edges covered in dark, flaking stains. "That's it!" she cried, pointing to it. The journal mentioned Blackwood using a sacred object to bind the entity. If we can use that to channel the ritual, maybe we can sever the connection. Another crash echoed through the church, the doors buckling as the entity tried to force its way inside. The shadows around the room seemed to shift and writhe, reaching toward them like grasping hands. Sarah rushed to the altar, grabbing the crucifix just as the doors exploded inward, sending shards of wood flying. The entity, now fully manifested, stood in the doorway. It was a grotesque, shifting mass of shadows and limbs, its eyes glowing with a hungry, malevolent light. "Do it now!" Liam screamed, writhing on the floor as the mark on his arm pulsed like a living thing. "It's taking over." Dylan read aloud from the journal, his voice trembling. "By the power of the sacred bond, I sever thee. By light, by faith, return to the void from whence you came." Sarah thrust the crucifix toward Liam, pressing it against the mark on his arm. The moment the cold metal touched his skin, the mark erupted in a blinding flash of light, and Liam screamed, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to shake the very walls of the church. The entity howled, its form flickering and distorting as if caught in a violent storm. The shadows in the church swirled, the air filled with the sounds of screaming voices, hundreds of souls that had been trapped for decades, finally released. With one final scream, the entity's form shattered like glass, and the mark on Liam's arm faded into nothingness. He collapsed, gasping for air, the pain finally subsiding. For a moment, the church was silent. Then slowly, Liam opened his eyes. The mark was gone, and the whispers had ceased. But the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. "It's over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dylan shook his head slowly, staring at the journal's last cryptic passage. "For now. But if we didn't do it right, it's only a matter of time before it returns." Emma looked at Liam, who was still shaking. "We've got to find a way to destroy it for good, before it finds another host." As they stepped outside into the cold, pre-dawn light, a chill wind whispered through the trees. The house was quiet now, but they all knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Because the entity was patient, and it was always hungry. The dawn light barely touched the town as they stumbled out of the old church. The sky was painted in a dull gray, a thick mist hanging over everything like a shroud. The world outside felt muted, as if the entity's darkness had seeped into reality itself. But for the first time in what felt like hours, the whispers had stopped, and the air was no longer filled with the cold presence of the house. Liam leaned heavily on Emma, his strength nearly gone. The mark was gone, but the ordeal had left him weak, as though the entity had drained something vital from him. Sarah and Dylan walked beside them, their eyes darting nervously around the deserted streets, expecting the shadows to move at any moment. "We need to get Liam somewhere safe," Emma said, her voice shaking. "We can't keep running like this." Dylan nodded, clutching the journal to his chest. "But it's not over," he muttered. "The journal said that even if we severed the connection, the entity could still return if it found another source of fear. It's only a matter of time." Liam's eyes were glassy, unfocused. He could hear Dylan, but his mind was distant, filled with fragmented memories of the entity's whispers. It had burrowed into his mind, leaving behind traces of its presence. "The hunger, it's never satisfied," he whispered, almost to himself. "It'll keep coming until it's fed." Emma looked at him, her face pale. "Fed? What do you mean?" Liam's gaze drifted toward the distant outline of Blackwood House, barely visible through the thick fog. "The journal. The entity is bound to that place, but it needs a soul to feed on. That's why it marked me, why it took Marcus. It needs someone to keep it tethered to this world." Sarah's breath hitched. "So, it's not gone? We're just delaying it? It'll come back?" Dylan flipped through the journal frantically, trying to make sense of the cryptic passages. "There's a section here about a final ritual. It's vague, but it mentions an ultimate sacrifice, a soul willingly given to the entity to break its bond with the house once and for all." "A sacrifice?" Emma whispered, her face draining of color. "You mean one of us?" Liam nodded slowly. "If someone willingly offers themselves to the entity, it will be forced to take them, but it would break its link to the house. Without the house, it can't stay in this world. It would be banished forever." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head violently. "There has to be another way. We can't just sacrifice one of us." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but deep down, they all knew the truth. The entity was relentless. It had tasted their fear, fed on their pain, and it would not stop until it had consumed them all. They had severed its connection to Liam, but only temporarily. It was only a matter of time before it found another way to return. "We have to end this," Liam said, his voice steadier now. "If we don't, it'll keep coming after us, and it won't stop with us. It'll take anyone who gets close to that house." The group fell into a heavy silence. The fog swirled around them, the air growing colder again, as if the entity was already reaching out from its prison, desperate to find a new anchor. Dylan clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "If it's a sacrifice it wants, I'll do it," he said, his voice rough with determination. "I'm the one who pushed us to go to the house. I'm the one who found the journal. This is my fault." "No," Emma shouted, grabbing his arm. "We don't even know if this will work. You can't just throw your life away on a maybe." "It's the only chance we have," Dylan snapped back, his voice breaking. "If I don't do this, the entity will keep hunting us. It'll take you, Sarah, Liam, everyone. I can't let that happen." Liam, struggling to stand on his own, placed a hand on Dylan's shoulder. "No, you've done enough, Dylan. This is my responsibility." He looked around at his friends, his eyes filled with, "I brought you all here. I insisted we stay in that house. If anyone should pay the price, it's me." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she shook her head, her voice breaking. "Liam, no, you can't do this. There has to be another way." "There isn't," he said quietly. "We've run out of time. If we don't do this now, we might never get another chance." Emma clutched the journal, her hands trembling. "If you're really going to do this, we need to follow the instructions exactly. The entity, it's tricky. If it senses fear, hesitation, it might break free entirely." Dylan nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "The ritual has to be performed at the house," he said. "We'll use the altar in the basement. That's where it's strongest, but it's also where we have the best chance to bind it for good." With heavy hearts, they turned back toward Blackwood House. The fog thickened as they approached, swallowing the light of the rising sun and plunging the world into an unnatural twilight. The mansion loomed before them like a sentinel of darkness, its windows glowing faintly, as if welcoming them back into its clutches. As they crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, filling their minds with a chorus of despair. The house seemed to pulse with dark energy, like a beating heart. The group made their way down to the basement, the shadows seeming to reach out for them. The ritual circle they had used before was still etched into the floor, the dried blood now glowing with an ominous light. Liam stepped into the circle, his face pale but resolute. "You all need to stay back," he said firmly. "If the ritual is interrupted, the entity might break loose." Emma opened the journal to the final page, her hands shaking. "Liam, you have to focus," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You can't show any fear, any doubt. The entity will sense it and use it against you." Liam nodded, closing his eyes as he tried to calm his racing heart. The others stood just outside the circle, watching helplessly as he prepared to sacrifice himself to save them all. Dylan began to chant the incantation from the journal, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. The air in the basement grew colder, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, taking on horrific shapes. The entity appeared in the circle, a roiling mass of darkness with glowing, hateful eyes. It stared at Liam, a low, mocking laughter filling the room. "You think you can bind me?" it hissed, its voice a blend of countless tormented souls. "You think you can stop me with your pathetic ritual?" Liam didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. "Take me and release the others. I'm the one you want." The entity paused, its eyes narrowing. It could sense something in Liam's voice, a resolve it couldn't break. The shadows seemed to hesitate, the whispers growing quieter, almost as if the entity were considering his offer. Dylan finished the chant, and a blinding light erupted from the circle, enveloping Liam and the entity. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air filled with a deafening roar. For a moment it felt as though the entire house would collapse, the walls shaking violently. Then, with a final agonized scream, the entity was pulled back into the darkness, and the light vanished. When the dust settled, Liam was lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. The mark was gone, and the air was still. The house was silent, its malevolent presence finally extinguished. But as the others rushed to Liam's side, Dylan noticed something strange. The last entry in the journal had changed. "The house may sleep, but it will never die. A sacrifice was made, but the hunger remains. One day it will awaken again, and it will be hungry." The oppressive silence of Blackwood House was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. The basement, once filled with the entity's malevolent presence, now lay eerily quiet. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and the flickering light from their flashlights revealed the ritual circle, now dark and lifeless. Liam's body was sprawled on the cold stone floor, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Emma knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she checked for a pulse. "He's alive!" she gasped, relief flooding her voice. "But he's not waking up." Sarah and Dylan rushed over, but even as they reached Liam, the ominous air in the room did not lift. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, as if waiting for them to let down their guard. The cold, damp walls seemed to close in around them, a reminder that they were still trapped inside this cursed place. "We have to get him out of here," Dylan urged, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The journal. It said we could banish the entity, but it also said that the house would never truly die. If it senses we've won, it'll try to trap us in here forever. "But he's too weak to move," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "He sacrificed himself to save us. How can we just carry him through this house? We don't even know if it's really over." Sarah stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes. She turned to face Dylan and Emma, her voice filled with determination. "We don't have a choice. If we stay here, the house will reclaim him, and us too. We need to find a way out, and we need to do it fast." Dylan nodded reluctantly. "All right, but we have to be careful. If the house realizes the entity is gone, it might start closing off exits, trapping us inside again." He looked at the dark, twisting corridors beyond the basement door. We'll need to find the original way we came in. That's our best chance. Together, they hoisted Liam to his feet, each of them supporting him as best they could. He was barely conscious, his eyes fluttering open now and then, but he was too weak to speak. Every step was a struggle, but they were driven by a shared fear. They had come so close to ending this nightmare, and they couldn't let it reclaim them now. The house seemed different now, but not in the way they had hoped. The once labyrinthine hallways felt almost suffocating, the walls seeming to shift and pulse, as if the entire structure was alive and furious. It was as though Blackwood House was wounded, angry that it had been denied its prize. As they moved through the dark corridors, the air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. The house groaned, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet as if something massive was moving beneath them. Dylan's flashlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. "Is it me?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Or does it feel like the house is watching us?" Emma shivered. "It's always been watching, but now it knows we're trying to leave." The hallway ahead split into two directions. Emma paused, looking left and right, trying to remember the way they had come. "It was to the left, right?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "No," Dylan countered, shaking his head. "We turned right to get to the basement. We need to go left now." Sarah looked between the two paths, fear tightening in her chest. The air seemed colder to the left, an almost palpable malevolence leaking from the dark corridor. "I don't know. I feel like something's wrong that way." But there was no time to argue. Behind them they heard a faint, dragging sound, like nails scraping against stone. It was slow, methodical, as if something deep within the house had awakened, furious that its prey was trying to escape. "Move," Dylan urged, choosing the left corridor and dragging Liam along. The others followed, their fear propelling them forward. As they hurried down the hallway, the walls seemed to pulse and tremble. The sound of scraping grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. They glanced back, but all they could see was darkness closing in behind them, swallowing the light. "We're going in circles," Emma panted, panic rising in her voice. This is impossible!" Dylan stopped abruptly, looking around in desperation. "The house is trying to confuse us. It's shifting again. It doesn't want us to leave." Suddenly, Sarah screamed. The floor beneath her feet gave way, and she fell through a gaping hole that had appeared out of nowhere. Dylan lunged forward, grabbing her arm just in time, but she dangled over a dark void that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath them. "Help me!" Sarah cried, her voice high with terror. Emma rushed over, grabbing Sarah's other arm, while Dylan strained to pull her back up. "We've got you," he grunted, his muscles straining. "Just hold on." With a final heave, they managed to pull her out of the pit, and she collapsed onto the floor, shaking. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "The house," Dylan said, his voice grim. "It's trying to separate us. It's toying with us." Liam, barely conscious, managed to whisper, "We need to find the heart, the house's heart." Emma's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "The journal, it mentioned the heart of the house," Liam murmured weakly. "Blackwood wrote that the house had a core, a place where its power is strongest. If we can find it, maybe we can destroy it, for good." Dylan's eyes lit up with realization. That must be why it's trying so hard to stop us. If we reach the heart and destroy it, the house won't be able to trap us anymore. "But where is it?" Sarah asked, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "How do we find it?" Liam's eyes fluttered shut, but he whispered, "It's beneath the basement, deeper." "The sub-basement," Dylan said, understanding dawning on him. "There must be a lower level, a place Blackwood hid from everyone, even from the entity." Determined, they turned back, heading once again for the basement stairs. The house groaned in fury, the walls shaking as if the entire structure was coming apart. Doors slammed shut behind them, and the air was filled with the sounds of wailing voices, hundreds of them, all crying out in agony. Finally, they reached the basement, only to find the floor had cracked open, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that led deeper underground. The air that emanated from below was freezing, and it reeked of decay and rot. "This has to be it," Dylan said, peering into the darkness, the heart of the house. As they descended the staircase, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The shadows around them seemed to reach out with grasping hands, desperate to pull them back. But they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that this was their last chance to end it all. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vast, cavernous chamber. In the center was a grotesque, pulsating mass, a tangle of roots, stone, and darkness, beating slowly like a diseased heart. The air was thick with malevolence, and the ground beneath them seemed to throb with every pulse. "That's it," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. "The heart of the house." Dylan opened the journal one last time, reading aloud the final passage. "To destroy the heart, one must sever the bond willingly. Blood must be spilled, not in fear, but in defiance." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with dread. Liam, struggling to stand, took a deep breath. "It means one of us has to offer themselves willingly, not to the entity, but to destroy its source of power." The house seemed to tremble in response, the air filling with an angry, inhuman roar. Time was running out. As the heart pulsed faster, they realized they had only one chance to escape. But it would come at The cavernous chamber beneath the house felt like stepping into the belly of a beast. The walls pulsed rhythmically, oozing a foul black ichor that dripped to the floor like blood. The grotesque mass at the center of the room, the heart of Blackwood House, throbbed with each beat, casting sickly shadows that writhed on the stone walls. The group stood in a tight circle, staring at the entity's heart in horrified awe. It was a tangled, grotesque structure, a blend of roots, sinew, and stone, pulsating with a sickly, crimson glow. Dark veins crisscrossed its surface, pumping a black, tar-like substance that seemed to breathe life into the house itself. The air was thick with the stench of decay, making it hard to breathe. Emma's hands were shaking as she flipped through the journal's pages one last time. The final entry was nearly illegible, scribbled in a frantic hand, but its message was clear. To destroy the heart, a willing sacrifice must be made. Only the blood of one who offers themselves freely can sever the bond. Liam, barely able to stand, leaned against the cold stone wall. His eyes were glassy, but there was a new clarity in them, a grim acceptance of what needed to be done. "This is it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't leave here until that thing is destroyed. It's the only way to make sure the house can't hurt anyone else." "But a sacrifice?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. It doesn't have to mean one of us." Dylan shook his head, a dark, resigned look in his eyes. "It does. The journal is clear. Blackwood tried to seal it, but he was too afraid. That's why it never worked. This thing feeds on fear, but it can be defeated by courage, by someone willing to face it." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Liam. "You can't do this, Liam. You've already sacrificed enough. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Liam said, his voice steady now. "It's connected to me. I can still feel it, whispering in my mind, trying to claw its way back. If we don't end this here, it'll just keep coming back, stronger each time." "But what if it's a trick?" Sarah cried, grabbing Liam's arm. "What if it just wants you to sacrifice yourself so it can take over completely?" Liam shook his head slowly, meeting her tearful gaze. "No, I can feel it weakening. We severed its connection, but the house is still keeping it alive. If we destroy the heart, it won't have anywhere to go. It'll be banished forever." Emma swallowed hard, looking at the heart with a mixture of dread and determination. "But it says the sacrifice has to be made willingly," she said, her voice trembling. No fear, no hesitation. The ground beneath them trembled, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close in, like the house itself was listening, desperate to stop them. The heart pulsed faster, its glow intensifying, as if it sensed its end was near. Suddenly, the shadows around them twisted violently, taking on forms that resembled faces of those who had been lost to the house over the years. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers returned, louder, more desperate, as if begging them to stop. "You think you can defeat me?" A deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber. It was the entity, speaking directly through the heart. "You are nothing but insects in my domain. You think one of you can sacrifice yourself and end me? I am eternal. This house is my prison, but also my power. I will consume you all." Sarah, Emma, and Dylan staggered back, clutching their ears as the voice filled their minds, assaulting them with visions of darkness and despair. But Liam stood firm, his gaze locked on the pulsating heart. "Enough," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The entity laughed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh, but you are. I can taste it, your fear, your doubt. You can't hide it from me." Liam turned to Dylan, who was still clutching the journal. "Read the final incantation," he said urgently. "You need to seal the ritual while I do this." Dylan's hands trembled as he flipped to the last page. The ancient words were written in a language none of them understood, but it was their only hope. "Liam, are you sure about this?" Dylan asked, his voice breaking. "We can find another way." "There is no other way," Liam replied, stepping toward the heart. The shadows swirled around him, clawing at his skin, but he pressed forward. "If I don't do this, the house will never stop. It'll keep feeding, keep growing stronger. It'll take all of us." Emma couldn't hold back her tears. "Liam, please, there has to be another way." Liam gave her a sad smile, reaching out to touch her cheek. "This is the only way to save you, to save all of us." He looked at Dylan. "Now do it. Start reading." Dylan nodded, wiping away his tears. He began to chant the incantation, his voice shaking but steady. The words echoed through the chamber, mixing with the furious howls of the entity. The shadows writhed violently, trying to stop him, but the light from the journal seemed to hold them at bay. Liam stepped into the center of the ritual circle, directly beneath the heart. The dark veins snaked toward him, sensing the sacrifice, and the heart pulsed faster, as if anticipating its next meal. Liam drew a deep breath, then pulled a small, rusted knife from his pocket, one he had taken from the house's twisted altar earlier. The entity's voice turned from mocking to desperate. "No, no, you don't know what you're doing. I am eternal. I cannot be defeated." Liam's eyes were filled with resolve. "I may not defeat you, but I can make sure you never hurt anyone again." He plunged the knife into his own palm, letting his blood spill onto the ground. The moment the blood hit the floor, the heart let out a shriek that shook the entire chamber. The ground quaked, and the walls began to crack, beams of light piercing through the darkness. "Dylan, finish it!" Liam yelled, blood pouring from his hand as he pressed it against the throbbing heart. Dylan's voice rose in a final, desperate chant. The ancient words filled the air, mixing with the entity's agonized screams. The heart began to shrivel, the dark veins retracting like dying vines. The light grew brighter, blinding them all. There was a deafening roar and then silence. The heart was gone. The house's dark energy dissipated, leaving behind a hollow stillness. Liam collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him. The mark on his arm vanished, leaving only a faint scar. "Liam!" Emma screamed, rushing to his side. Sarah and Dylan followed, their hearts breaking as they reached him. Liam's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile on his lips. "It's over," he whispered. "You're free. All of you." "No, no, we can still save you," Emma sobbed, pressing her hands over his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You can't leave us." But Liam's eyes were already closing. Promise me you'll live without fear," he whispered. And then, with a final shuddering breath, he was gone. The house, now lifeless, began to crumble around them. The walls collapsed inward, dust and debris filling the air. Dylan grabbed Emma and Sarah, pulling them away. "We have to go now!" They ran up the crumbling staircase, leaving behind the body of their friend who had saved them. As they burst through the front doors, the house collapsed in on itself, the dark legacy of Blackwood House finally coming to an end. Outside, in the light of dawn, they stood in silence, the weight of their loss heavy in the cold morning air. Liam was gone, but the nightmare was finally over, or so they thought. The cold light of dawn bathed the remnants of Blackwood House in a muted, gray haze. The once imposing mansion was now reduced to a pile of broken stone, shattered wood, and twisted metal. A thick mist still clung to the surrounding forest, as if the house's dark presence had seeped into the very land itself. Emma, Sarah, and Dylan stood on the overgrown lawn, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Their breaths formed clouds in the frigid morning air, but none of them seemed to notice. The only thing they could focus on was the reality of what had just happened. Their friend, Liam, was gone. He did it, Sarah said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She was trembling, both from the cold and the aftershock of what they had just experienced. He actually did it. Dylan nodded slowly, his face expressionless. Yeah, he saved us. But there was no relief in his voice, only a hollow numbness that seemed to echo in the stillness around them. Emma stood apart from the others, her hands clenched into fists. She stared at the ruins of the house, her eyes red from crying. Liam shouldn't have died, she said through gritted teeth. We should have found another way. We were too slow, too scared. There was no other way, Dylan replied, his tone somber but resolute. The entity needed a willing sacrifice to destroy the heart. Liam knew that. He made his choice. Emma turned on him, her eyes blazing. How can you just accept that? He's gone, Dylan. He sacrificed himself, and we just stood there and let him. Sarah stepped between them, tears streaming down her face. Stop it, both of you. This is what the house wanted to break us, to make us turn on each other. She choked back a sob. Liam wouldn't want this. Dylan looked down, unable to meet Emma's furious gaze. You're right, he muttered. I'm sorry, Emma. I don't know what to feel anymore. The group fell into a heavy silence, the morning light gradually brightening as the sun rose higher. But even as the light grew, it did nothing to lift the weight of the darkness that still clung to their hearts. After a long, painful pause, Dylan finally spoke up. We should go, he said, his voice hollow. There's nothing left for us here. We should get back to town, figure out how to explain all of this. Emma and Sarah nodded reluctantly, turning to leave the ruins behind. But just as they were about to walk away, something strange caught Dylan's eye. Amidst the debris of the house, partially buried under rubble, was the journal, the same journal that had guided them through their nightmare. No way, Dylan whispered, his heart skipping a beat. That should have been destroyed with the house. He picked his way through the rubble, ignoring the protests of Emma and Sarah. He reached down and pulled the journal free from the debris. It was worn, the leather cover scorched and cracked, but otherwise intact. What the hell? Sarah muttered, staring at the journal in disbelief. How did it survive? Dylan flipped it open, his hands trembling. The pages were still legible, though they smelled faintly of smoke. But as he flipped to the final entry, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The entry that Liam had read, the one that had guided him to sacrifice himself, was different now. A sacrifice was made, but the house is never truly satisfied. It is bound, not destroyed, and it waits, hungry for another soul to take its place. Dylan's hands shook as he read the final line aloud. Emma's face went pale, and Sarah let out a choked sob. No, that's not possible, Emma stammered. We saw the heart destroyed. We saw the house collapse. Liam gave his life to end it. But even as she spoke, a cold breeze swept through the ruins, carrying with it a faint, all-too-familiar whisper. I am not done. You cannot escape. The house is eternal. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, her eyes wide with terror. No, this can't be happening. It's supposed to be over. Dylan slammed the journal shut, his face a mask of fury and despair. It's not over, he said, his voice trembling. We were wrong. The house, it tricked us. It never intended to let us go. What do you mean? Emma demanded, panic rising in her voice. Liam sacrificed himself. He was supposed to be the last soul. Dylan shook his head slowly, his eyes hollow. The entity lied. It never planned to stop. It just needed enough fear, enough pain to strengthen its bond. And now it's free again. A sense of dread washed over them as the wind picked up, swirling around the ruins. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of tortured voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. One soul was not enough. The house will rise again, and it will take all who dare to defy it. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. "We have to get out of here," she shouted. "We need to get as far away from this place as we can." But Dylan, his eyes fixed on the journal, shook his head. "It's not just the house anymore," he said quietly. "The entity, it's no longer bound to this place. When Liam died, he broke its chains. It's free to roam now, and it'll come for us, no matter where we go." Sarah's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the ground, sobbing. Then what do we do? How do we stop it?" Dylan looked up at her, his expression grim. "There's only one thing we can do," he said, opening the journal to a new page that had appeared. The ink was fresh, as if it had been written only moments ago. "The entity's hunger has no end. It will seek out the ones who escaped, feeding on their fear. But there is a way to trap it, by drawing it into a new vessel, one that is willingly offered. Only then can its power be contained once more." Emma's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. No way. You're saying one of us has to take its place? To bind it?" Dylan nodded, his face pale. "It's the only way to stop it from hunting us, from hunting anyone else." "But who?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's going to—" Before she could finish, the wind howled, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The entity was coming for them, furious that they had escaped its grasp. "Decide quickly," Dylan urged, his eyes darting around the ruins. "If we don't, it'll take us all." As the ground shook and the whispers grew into a deafening roar, the three survivors realized they had to make an impossible choice, one that would cost one of them their life. And in the shadows of the crumbling ruins, the entity watched, waiting hungrily for its next victim. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the air filled with the guttural whispers of the entity, now unbound from its prison. The ruins of Blackwood House seemed to come alive around them, shifting and groaning, as if the very earth beneath them were being twisted by dark forces. Emma, Sarah, and Dylan huddled together, their faces pale, their breaths coming in short gasps as they realized the grim truth. They were out of time. Dylan clutched the journal to his chest, his hands trembling as he flipped through its pages. Fresh ink now bled through the old parchment, written by a hand that was not his own, detailing the grim instructions for the ritual to bind the entity once more. The words seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the journal itself was alive. "Someone has to become the new vessel," Dylan whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of what he was saying. "The entity's power, it needs a soul to anchor it. If we don't act now, it'll tear through us all, and then move on to anyone it can find." Sarah's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. I can't do it, Dylan. Please don't make me." She clutched her hands to her chest, as if trying to shield her heart from the terrible reality of their situation. Emma turned to Dylan, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and desperation. "There has to be another way. You can't just ask one of us to sacrifice ourselves. This thing, it tricked us once. It'll trick us again." Dylan shook his head, his expression grim. "It's the only way to stop it. The journal's clear. The entity must be willingly bound to a new vessel. Without that, it will roam free, feeding on fear and death." Emma's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution, but the howling wind and the malevolent whispers were drowning out her thoughts. The entity was drawing closer, its shadowy presence pressing against the edges of their minds, amplifying their terror. She could feel it, tendrils of darkness reaching into her thoughts, prying at her deepest fears. "Why does it have to be one of us?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "What if we find something else to trap it in? There has to be something." "There's no time," Dylan interrupted, his voice rising. "It's already here." As if to confirm his words, a blast of icy wind struck them, sending Sarah sprawling to the ground. The shadows around them thickened, coalescing into a swirling vortex of darkness. Out of the maelstrom emerged the entity, its form now grotesquely humanoid, with limbs that twisted and shifted like black smoke. Its eyes were empty pits of darkness, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You think you can bind me again?" The entity hissed, its voice a cacophony of tortured souls. "There is no escape. One of you will be mine." Dylan, clutching the journal, glanced at Emma and Sarah. His eyes were filled with resolve, but also a deep, agonizing sadness. "I can't ask either of you to do this," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "This is on me. I started this when I insisted we come here. I'll be the vessel." "No!" Emma screamed, grabbing his arm. "Dylan, no! You can't give yourself up like that. We're supposed to find another way." But Dylan pulled away, his face set in grim determination. "If I don't do this, it'll kill all of us, and then it'll keep going, hurting others. We can't let it escape." Sarah shook her head violently, her voice choked with sobs. "There has to be another way. You can't sacrifice yourself. Please, Dylan." The entity let out a low, rumbling laugh that seemed to shake the very air. "Your pathetic resolve means nothing," it taunted, its shadowy form inching closer. "But I will accept your offering, if you can prove your will." Dylan took a deep breath, then stepped forward, holding the journal out in front of him. "Fine," he said, his voice strong despite the fear in his eyes. "Take me, but leave them alone. I offer myself willingly." The entity paused, its black eyes narrowing. It seemed to savor Dylan's words, the air growing heavier, as if the darkness itself was feeding on his resolve. "Very well," it hissed. "Step into the circle and bind yourself to me." Dylan nodded, turning to Emma and Sarah one last time. "Whatever happens, get out of here," he whispered. "Don't look back. If this works, you'll be free." Tears streamed down Emma's face, but she knew there was no stopping him. "You don't have to do this, Dylan." But he had already turned away, stepping into the circle of blackened earth that had appeared at the heart of the ruins. The moment his foot crossed the line, the ground beneath him seemed to ignite with dark flames, swirling around him in a maelstrom of shadows. The entity loomed above him, its form growing darker and more monstrous, a twisted amalgamation of limbs, claws, and eyes. "Repeat after me," the entity whispered, its voice now a seductive murmur. "Bind yourself to me and become my vessel forever." Dylan's voice trembled as he began to chant the incantation written in the journal, his words barely audible over the roaring wind. As he spoke, the shadows around him thickened, coiling around his body like a nest of serpents. Pain etched itself across his face, but he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. But suddenly, Emma's eyes widened as she noticed something in the journal's margins, a line she hadn't seen before, written in what looked like fresh blood. "The entity can be deceived. If it believes it has won, it can be banished. The vessel must pretend to submit, then sever the bond at the final moment with a willing heart and the blood of a friend." Emma's mind raced. "Dylan, stop!" she screamed. "It's a trick. You can sever it at the last moment. You just need..." But it was too late. Dylan was already finishing the chant. His eyes glazed over as the entity's shadows consumed him. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a pit of darkness that seemed to go on forever. Emma, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a shard of broken glass from the ground and slashed her own palm. Blood dripped onto the earth as she ran toward Dylan, her voice filled with desperation. "Dylan, take my hand. You have to break free now. The blood of a friend, it's the only way." Dylan's eyes flickered, a brief moment of clarity piercing through the darkness. "Emma," he whispered, reaching out. The entity roared in fury, sensing the betrayal. "No, you will not escape me." But Emma was already there, grabbing Dylan's hand and pressing her bleeding palm to his. "Now, Dylan," she screamed. "Sever the bond. Use my blood." With a final, agonized scream, Dylan tore himself free from the shadows. The dark flames around him sputtered and died, and the entity let out a deafening howl of rage. The circle beneath them erupted in a blinding light, and the ground quaked violently as the entity was pulled into the abyss. For a moment, everything was chaos. The air was filled with the sound of shattering glass, the ground beneath their feet crumbling. Then, with one last ear-splitting shriek, the entity was gone. The light faded, leaving behind a stunned silence. Dylan collapsed into Emma's arms, his body trembling. The journal lay open on the ground, its pages slowly turning to ash. "It's over," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. Is it really over?" But Dylan, still shaking, looked at Emma, his eyes filled with sorrow. "No, it's only bound. The house is gone, but the entity, it's still trapped, and now it's bound to me." The ground beneath them was silent, but the air was thick with a lingering darkness. They had bought themselves time, but they all knew the end. The sun was beginning to rise, casting weak rays of light through the lingering mist. Emma, Sarah, and Dylan stood in the ruins of Blackwood House, their breaths misting in the cold air. The once oppressive darkness seemed to have lifted, but a sense of dread still clung to them like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. The journal lay in ashes, its final pages disintegrating into the wind. Dylan was leaning against a toppled pillar, his face pale and drawn. The fresh wound on his hand had stopped bleeding, but his fingers trembled as if he could still feel the entity's presence coiling beneath his skin. Emma stood beside him, her eyes never leaving his face, afraid that he might slip away if she looked away even for a moment. "We did it, didn't we?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would wake the malevolent force they had only just subdued. "No," Dylan replied, his voice hollow. "We stopped it from escaping, but we didn't destroy it. It's bound, but now it's bound to me." Emma shook her head, refusing to accept it. "There has to be another way, Dylan. We can find someone who knows more about this curse. We can get you free." But Dylan just looked at her with a sad, tired smile. "You don't understand, Emma. The entity's not just in the house anymore. It's in me. I can feel it, whispering, waiting. It's hungry, and it's only getting stronger." The air around them seemed to chill even further, as if the entity's presence was still lingering, just out of sight. The house might have crumbled, but the malevolent force that had once haunted its halls was not gone. It had simply changed its prison. "Then, we have to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "If it's bound to you, Dylan, maybe we can, I don't know, take you somewhere safe, somewhere far away." Dylan pushed himself to his feet, shaking his head slowly. "It's not that simple. The entity feeds on fear, on pain. If I go with you, it'll feed on your fear too. It'll get stronger. Eventually, it'll break free." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step toward him. "No, we can't just leave you. There has to be a way. Please, Dylan, we're not going to abandon you." But Dylan's gaze was distant, haunted. He had felt the entity burrowing into his mind, had heard its promises, its threats. It was like a parasite, feeding off his soul, twisting his thoughts. He knew that as long as he was with them, it would never stop trying to break free. "Listen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's only one way to end this. I can't stay with you. I have to go, far away, somewhere remote, somewhere where it won't have anyone else to feed on." He looked at them, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. "You have to let me go." "No, Dylan, we can't," Emma pleaded, her voice breaking. "There's got to be another way. We'll find it together, just like we always have." Dylan shook his head again. "I don't have time," he whispered, glancing down at his hand. The mark, the same one that had appeared on Marcus and then on Liam, was now visible on his wrist, spreading slowly like a creeping infection. "The entity is getting stronger. If I stay, it'll find a way to use me, to hurt more people. I won't let it do that." Sarah sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands. "There has to be something in the journal or some other ritual." But Dylan only shook his head. "The journal's gone, and even if it wasn't, it would just lead us in circles. The entity tricked us once. It won't hesitate to do it again." A heavy silence hung between them, broken only by the distant sound of birds beginning to chirp as the sun rose higher. For a moment the world seemed almost normal again, as if the nightmare they had just endured was nothing more than a bad dream. But the mark on Dylan's wrist was a stark reminder that the nightmare was not over. It was merely beginning to take on a new form. "Where will you go?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Dylan replied. "Somewhere remote, a place where no one else can be hurt. I'll figure out a way to contain it. Maybe I can hold it off long enough to find a real solution." Emma's tears flowed freely now, but she nodded, knowing in her heart that this was the only way. "Promise me," she said, her voice trembling. "Promise me you'll keep fighting. Don't let it win, Dylan." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I promise," he whispered, though even he didn't know if he could keep that promise. Sarah stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. "We won't stop looking for a way to help you, Dylan. We'll find something, anything, to get you free." Dylan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He pulled Sarah into a tight hug, then turned to Emma, who threw her arms around him, clinging to him, as if she could somehow hold him back from the darkness that was threatening to consume him. "I have to go," he said softly, pulling away. "The longer I stay, the harder it'll be for me to leave." Emma nodded, her heart breaking as she watched him turn away. "We won't forget you," she whispered. "We'll find you when it's safe." Without another word, Dylan began to walk away, disappearing into the dense woods that surrounded the ruins of Blackwood House. The shadows seemed to part for him, as if acknowledging that he was now one of them. Emma and Sarah stood there, watching until he was gone, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the ground. But even in the light of day, the air was filled with a sense of foreboding. The entity was still out there, lurking in the darkness that had taken root in Dylan's soul. Sarah turned to Emma, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Emma took a deep breath, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "We go back," she said with a steely resolve. "We find whatever information we can about Blackwood, about the entity, about every ritual ever written. We won't stop until we figure out how to save Dylan." "But what if we're too late?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Emma looked into the distance where Dylan had disappeared. "Then we'll make sure that if he can't come back, we'll finish what he started. We'll destroy that thing for good." The two of them turned and began the long walk back to town, leaving the ruins of Blackwood House behind. But the shadows were never far from their minds. And deep in the woods, Dylan could already feel the entity stirring, whispering promises of power, freedom, and hunger. As the mist swallowed him whole, he whispered to himself, "I won't let it win. I can't." But even he wasn't sure how long he could hold out. Because the entity was patient, and it was always hungry, and it knew that sooner or later everyone breaks.